Hey friends, it's Sam from DIY Huntress, and today I'm going to show you how I transform some scrap wood into a pretty epic cutting board. Let's get started. Oh, I feel like I nailed that transition. I am juggling so many projects right now behind the scenes, so I figured why not just share a very gentle scrap wood project with all of you this weekend on the channel. Alice, can you grab that for me? Huh? Titan, can you grab that for me? Come here. There are no help. As per usual, my leftover wood pile is getting out of control, and it was time to finally dip into it and make something cool. And besides, I owed somebody a gift, so this was kind of the perfect time to dive on into this pile of wood and make a cutting board. Now, if you've been hanging out with me for a while, you will know that I do have a cutting board tutorial on my channel already. And in that cutting board tutorial, I share how to make a cutting board without a planer. I'm going to do the same thing here because a lot of these pieces were pre-purchased as plain down, ready to go pieces. But I did actually publish a blog post along with this video. You can find the link for that below this video that will break down a couple of really simple ways to plane down or mill down your own lumber if you're working with really rough lumber. I've also linked all of the materials that I used for this project in that blog post as well. But that being said, let's jump on into this tutorial and what I am doing right now. So I started by cutting my pieces into just basic strips. I cut a couple of them into the same size width. I played around with smaller widths on other ones, and then I laid them all out in an order that I was really happy with. So because I wanted to do like the zigzag chevron looking pattern, I knew that I had to cut this thing at an angle later. And something I learned when I did my pattern plywood project was that if you glue things up in an angle, you actually cut off a lot less waste than if you just glue it up as a solid straight panel and try to cut an angle later. So that's just what I did. I tried to do 45 degrees at first, and that was a little too steep. So I did something a little more gentle than that. I don't remember offhand what it was. I think maybe 22.5 degrees, but it didn't have to be perfect because I'm just gonna size everything up later. But once I was generally happy with the game plan, I then glued everything up, clamped all these pieces together, and allowed them to dry overnight before even thinking about touching them. I also made sure to clean up some of that extra squeeze out of the glue because it's going to make cleaning up the board the next day so much easier. Some people are on team chisel dry glue away after it dries. Some people are on team wipe away glue while it's still wet. I personally like to take a damp rag and wipe away as much as I can because I just think it makes for much easier work the next day. The next day I was able to remove the board from the clamps. It took a little bit of persuasion here. They were definitely glued to the clamps. I forgot to put a paste wax on my clamps before adding the boards. That definitely helps with removing them later. But anyway, because I'd wiped away a lot of the glue, I just really needed to give this thing a good sanding. If you have a planer, you can definitely run your board through the planer at this point, but it's not necessary. In fact, if you're using boards that are the same thickness and you make sure that you glue them up pretty flat and solid, then you shouldn't have a terrible time trying to clean them up afterwards. This also doesn't have to be a perfect process yet because at this point there were still a couple more things I had to do before I could finally finish the board. In fact, the next step here was to cut my board into an angle. So I think I went with a 22.5 degree angle here. I cut a straight edge along one side of the board, and then I brought the board over to my table saw where I was able to cut consistent widths in the same exact angle for the rest of the board. I then brought those angled cuts back on over to the clamps and placed them in the exact same order that I cut them, but then I flipped every other board to create that zigzag or that chevron looking effect. And once I was happy with that design, I went back to the same exact gluing process that I did at the beginning of the project, where I spread out a lot of glue nice and evenly and then glued everything together and clamped it together and allowed it to dry overnight. And just like I mentioned earlier as well, it was really important to make sure that all of these pieces glued up as flat as possible. That can be kind of tricky sometimes when you're working with weird angles and you're trying to get things to line up, but it's going to make life so much easier later if you can try to glue everything up as straight and as flat as possible. After letting everything cure overnight, I then removed the cutting board from the clamps. This was the last time I had to do this process, which was very nice. And then I brought that cutting board over to my miter saw, where I cut the ends perfectly straight to prepare it for its final steps. One little note, you actually don't need a miter saw for this project at all. It just made my life a lot easier to use mine. You can do all of these cuts on a table saw, and you can check out how to do that if you look at my pattern plywood projects, because I use a lot of weird angles in those and I use them strictly with my table saw. Once the ends of the board were cut, it was time for my favorite part of the project, as I say in my most sarcastic voice ever, because there was a lot of sanding involved. But luckily, it wasn't so bad. I ended up sanding the entire board to 220 grit. And once it was sanded, I also then added some water to raise the grain. And this is a really important step, because if you don't do this and the first time you clean or wash the cutting board, the grain will pop and it'll feel rough to the touch. So by doing this, you're already training the grain to raise. And then once that dries, you sand it down again to 220 grit, and now the board won't feel gritty after you use it or wash it the first time. So after raising the grain and then sanding it one more time to 220 grit, it was time for the finishing touches, which was to add a cutting board oil. And I always use the same cutting board oil for all of my cutting boards, which is from Walrus Oil. I absolutely love this stuff. You add it on super thick, allow it to absorb into the board for a little bit, and then you just wipe away the excess using a clean rag. And it's honestly just so awesome. I've linked a bottle of what I use below this video, as well as on the blog post for this video. I highly recommend this product. But yeah, after adding the finish, this board was done and it was ready to dry for a little bit and then be sent off to the person that I owed a gift to. As a lot of you may know, because you follow me on this crazy journey, I'm often juggling so many things, so it's so nice to have a gentle weekend scrapwood project to be able to tackle in my spare time when I'm just feeling like I want to do some therapeutic woodworking. And honestly, cutting board projects are perfect for that, and it doesn't hurt that you can gift them to people that you really like. I hope you all love this project. If so, please make sure to subscribe to my channel and click that notification bell, because there are so many projects coming up on the channel in the very near future. But until then, friends, hope everyone is doing well and happy DIYing.